Right. Welcome to another session of client operating systems. And today we're naturally going to be looking at security features. And obviously, in our previous sessions, we were literally discussing the whole concept of the different features that are offered as far as the Windows 10 operating system is concerned. Ultimately, also discussing the whole concept of user management. But obviously, as far as today's session there is concerned, is just understanding exactly how to use the local security policy to literally secure your Windows 10 installation, enabling auditing to record security events, describe and literally configure your user account control as far as basic applets are concerned, looking at the whole concept of malware security features, obviously incorporated within the Windows 10 environment, use of data security features, and then ultimately also looking at securing Windows 10 by obviously using the Windows 10 update configuration there as far as your install would go. So ultimately, it's important to understand that these security policies just literally enable your Windows 10 installation to obviously become a bit more secure as far as basic usage and user experience there is concerned. I think one of the other things as well that you need to remember in terms of accessing the local security policy is that, like we've mentioned before, you need to literally be working with Windows 10 Pro or Enterprise. If you're working with Windows 10 Home, like we've mentioned before, naturally you won't be able to work with your security policy environments as far as configurations there are concerned. So ultimately, when you look at the whole concept of your administrative tools that we've looked at before, as far as your control panel environments they are concerned, you'll find that there is your local security policy as far as configurations would go. And this particular applet would distinctively show account policies all the way down to advanced audit policy configuration. So if we were to look at that quickly, as far as your configurations there would go, we want to look at your control panel quickly. And then obviously from your control panel, you should be able to find your administrative tools. Within that administrative tools function, you'll obviously be able to find your local security policy as far as configurations would go. So if you access your administrative tools within that environment, you should naturally be able to find your local security policy as part and parcel of configuration in that particular environment there. So if you look at what we've got in terms of the options, we've got a local security policy there, and obviously to access it, just double click on that particular icon there and you're good to go. Another way of accessing exactly the same security policy is to use the run applet, which is literally, again, one of the most common ways of accessing that particular setup there. Literally, just hit your Windows key on the keyboard plus the R key and ultimately type out secpol.msc, because remember, your security policy is part and parcel of your Microsoft Management Console environments. And again, like we've mentioned before, should you not be familiar with what each one of those distinctive icons are responsible for, remember, if you hover your mouse pointer on top of any one of those icons, there's obviously going to be a short description of what that particular applet does. So for instance, your local security policy enables you to view and modify local security policy, such as user rights and obviously audit policy as far as or audit policies in general as far as your machining mechanisms there is concerned. So ultimately, another way, like I mentioned, to access exactly the same environment is to hit the Windows key plus R. Once you do that, you can type out secpol.msc, which is obviously short for security policy. The MSC there is identifying it as part and parcel of the Microsoft console. Hit enter on the keyboard or click on OK, and ultimately that distinctive local security policy is displayed on screen. And then, like I was mentioning earlier on, when it comes to the actual contents of this local security policy, as you can see on screen there, you've got your account policies all the way down to advanced audit policy configuration. And obviously each one of these, I think we can close this one in the background there. Oopsie, that's the actual machine. Let's cancel that. We wanted to close this instead. All right. So I think that's the whole setup associated with your local security policy. As I was mentioning a couple of seconds ago, you've got account policies all the way down to advanced audit policy configuration as far as particular setups they are concerned. And naturally, each one of these particular sections, as far as your security policy is concerned, is just part and parcel of the larger Windows management system, which obviously would directly link to the group policy, which can literally be implemented on a local computer, but is typically part of a domain-based network as far as your configurations would go. So you've got a local policy that is configured on an actual local machine, but then when you're dealing with your domain-based infrastructures, literally your group policy configuration is your default go-to, and part and parcel of the whole Active Directory domain controller configuration when you're dealing with a networked environment. So obviously there's a variety of tools and security templates that can be used to obviously configure and analyze security policies as far as your basic install there is concerned. So with your account policies, your default go-tos, if you expand that particular section there, you find that you've got a password policy, and you literally also have an account lockout policy as far as your particular configurations there would go. And ultimately, you'll find that when it comes to the whole concept of your password policy, its main purpose is just to control password characteristics for all local user accounts. And obviously the available settings that you'll find there, if we were just to click on that particular option for us to see exactly what's happening in that environment, you've got enforce password history, maximum password age, you've got your minimum password age, you've got your minimum password length, you've got password should literally meet your complexity requirements, and then obviously store passwords using reversible encryption for added security in that particular instance. So obviously when you look at enforcement of password history, this particular setting is distinctively the number of password changes that literally must occur before a password can literally be reused. So ultimately, if, for example, you set that particular string to 3, for instance, that means that a password can only be reused every third time as far as your accounts they are concerned. And obviously by default, the value is 0 as far as configurations are concerned. And then obviously the maximum there is 24 passwords that are literally remembered as far as your password history configuration, as far as enforcement there would go. And then when you discuss, so when you're looking at changing that particular setting, for instance, all you have to do is either right click or double click on, so if you right click on that, you've got your properties. If you double click on that as well, you should be able to access exactly the same environment, which then just shows the current configuration associated with your local security setting there. As we'd seen previously, the default setting there is put to your 0, and obviously the maximum, like we mentioned before, is set to 24. And ultimately, again, what you'll normally identify, like I mentioned a couple of moments back, is if you're not familiar with what that particular part of your applet is responsible for, you've got a description tab that is there incorporated for you to understand specifically what that particular enforcement of the password history is all about, and literally enable you to make obviously an informed decision there as far as configuration, and obviously changing any values in that distinctive setup there is concerned. So ultimately, if you look at the default we were mentioning earlier on, you've got the 24 for the domain controllers, and then you've got 0 on your basic standalone computer systems or servers as far as configurations would go. And then naturally, if you look at your maximum password age, this particular setting is the maximum amount of time that a user can literally keep the same password without changing it. All right. So literally forcing password changes reduces the generic risk of obviously shared or hacked passwords being used over an extended period of time. And literally the default number of days in that instance is 42 days. And then you've got the opposite of that, which is your minimum password age. And obviously, as far as that particular setting there is concerned, it's the shortest time that a user can use a password before ultimately changing it. And naturally, a minimum password age is often used to ensure that users do not change their passwords several times in quick succession, obviously to continue using a single password. Again, the default value there is 0 days. So again, when you're looking at configuration, either double-clicking or right-clicking and selecting properties enables you to look at changing any particular settings in that particular instance. And then obviously, you've got that explanation associated with your configurations there as far as these particular applets are concerned. And then obviously your password minimum, your password obviously meeting complexity requirements. That's obviously typical examples would include your password literally cannot contain part of the user account's name for security purposes, must be at least 8 characters long, must contain characters meeting 3 of the following characteristics, which is your uppercase characters, your lowercase characters, numerals 0 to 9, and then obviously non-alphanumeric characters like your exclamation mark, your @ sign, your hash sign, and the $ are all examples of different non-numeric characters that can be used in your distinctive environment. Obviously, that's when you're dealing with your password requirements setting there. So again, if you access that currently disabled, but you obviously can enable it accordingly, dependent on the environment that you're working with at that particular point in time. And again, like I mentioned before, obviously when you're looking at the whole concept of the description, it lists exactly what I've just mentioned a couple of seconds ago in terms of the basic criteria that is applicable as far as your configurations there is concerned. Obviously gives you an idea or an example of what your non-numeric or non-alphabetic characters rather would typically include those exclamation marks, percent to the percentage sign that we were discussing a couple of seconds ago. And then obviously the numerals, and then your uppercase and your lowercase configurations in that regard. Obviously, when you're looking at the encryption, again, just scrambling data into a non-readable format for added security. When you look at the last option there, which is your passwords using reversible encryption, currently disabled as far as a particular setup or function there is concerned. But ultimately, what that is responsible for, this particular setting just controls how passwords are encrypted in your SAM database. So remember, SAM is short for Security Accounts Manager, and that particular database is the one that stores user credentials. So naturally, by default, like I was mentioning a couple of seconds ago, it's set as disabled. But obviously, your passwords are literally encrypted in a non-reversible format. So storing passwords using reversible encryption is literally required only when you're looking at compatibility with specific applications, such as remote access, for argument's sake, using what is commonly known as the Challenge Handshake Authentication Protocol, or CHAP. And obviously enabling this option would obviously enable the whole concept of storing passwords in a less secure way, and should not be enabled unless absolutely required to support a specific need in that instance as far as your particular setup there is concerned. So that's your password policy in a nutshell in terms of your particular local security policy there. And then obviously when you look at your account policy on the other hand, this is literally used to prevent unauthorized access to the Windows 10 installation there. So obviously using this in terms of typical examples would include obviously that basic lockout. Literally you can configure an account to obviously be temporarily disabled after a number of incorrect sign-in attempts. Normally the default amount there is 3, right? So you enter your incorrect username and password, ultimately automatically the account literally locks you out. And dependent on the configuration that is set, that particular account, once it locks you out, it obviously is locked. You'll then need to, in a networked environment, you then need to contact your network administrator to have that account unblocked and possibly your particular passwords reset. But obviously on a local machine, you can then specify that probably your account is locked out for a specific number of minutes, for instance, as far as basic configuration there is concerned. So if you were to look at that account lockout policy setup, like I was mentioning earlier on, you've got an account lockout duration as far as your particular setups are concerned. So obviously, when you look at that, it distinctively determines, again, like we said, how many minutes an account literally remains unlocked. By default, you're looking at about 30 minutes, but obviously this particular value is not distinctively configured until you've got your account lockout threshold specified. So obviously you can't dictate that, okay, an account is supposed to be locked out for an hour, for the 30 minutes by default and so on. If you haven't indicated initially that you've got a specific number of invalid attempts that obviously need to be experienced first, before that can literally take place. So if you look at your account lockout threshold, this then looks at how many invalid attempts that can be accommodated as far as the actual system there is concerned. Again, normally you find that in most instances, especially if you're looking at it from a networked environment, it's normally 3 attempts. But you can obviously push it up, push it down. But literally pushing it up can be a bit detrimental, because obviously that gives individuals or any individual that is trying to access that account in an unauthorized fashion more chances to guess the password, or more chances to actually access that distinctive account as far as your particular setup is concerned. So again, like I said before, its main purpose is just to determine the number of incorrect sign-in attempts that obviously must be performed before the account can distinctively get locked as far as your particular installations are concerned. So as you can see, that particular part is grayed out because there's nothing that has been set as far as this particular section is concerned. So if we were to set this, for instance, let's push this up to, let's put it as the default, or not necessarily default, but your common setup. Let's say 3 attempts there. We apply this. So it shows now, the moment you click on apply, it automatically shows you that you now have your applicable minutes that are there. So obviously, because the value in as far as your account lockout threshold is now 3 invalid login attempts, the settings for the following items obviously will be changed to suggested values that you can obviously change accordingly. So if you okay this, right, and we okay that. If we go back here now, as you can see, initially there was no information that was incorporated on your security setting. Same difference would go for the reset account lockout counter after a specific time frame. If you go back to your account lockout duration setting there, as you can see now, you've got that particular portion enabled. So you can actually push that up or push it down. It all depends in terms of which particular value you want to incorporate as far as your configurations they are concerned. So I think we can push this back to our 0 by default as far as your particular configurations they are concerned. And then we'll see what, so we're going to apply that. And obviously the moment we apply this, you'll find that these particular settings now obviously it's gone back to the initial setup that was there, which is not applicable for the account lockout duration, and obviously not applicable for the reset account lockout counter as far as your configuration there is concerned. But by default, the policy setting there is the 30 minutes that we had discussed just a couple of seconds back. So that's your account lockout policy, which is again part and parcel of your account policies at large there. But you also have other local policies that are responsible for auditing system access, assigning user rights, configuring specific security options. Now, remember, when you look at the whole concept of auditing, right, it distinctively lets you track when a specific user signs in, and obviously which resources that they used while they were signed in. So it's more or less just a basic reporting mechanism or an accounting mechanism that is there just to check what specific accounts have done on the system, how long they were online, how long they were logged in, what it is that they accessed. And obviously, this just makes it easier. Should any discrepancies take place, you can always have a proper audit trail that you can typically use to try and literally find an actual source of a problem, or literally find any particular beginning of a discrepancy if you're looking at it from a different point of view. So your generics, if you look at your local policies there, so if you expand your local policies section, you've got your audit policy all the way to your security options as far as configurations would go. So if you look at your user rights assignments, there's a lot of options that are there as far as basic policies would go, but the particular ones that you might want to familiarize yourself with is the obviously allow logon locally as far as your particular setup is concerned, and then discuss the whole concept of your backup files and directories, change the system time, load and unload device drivers, and then ultimately also look at shut down the actual system at large. So you've got that as a typical example, and then you also want to look at your backup, your files and directories. You want to look at change your system time. You want to, if you go down a bit, you want to also just familiarize yourself with your load and unload device drivers, as well as shutting down the system as far as your particular configurations they are concerned. So what these provide for, as far as settings would go, this literally controls which particular users, especially if you look at allow logon locally. So it controls which particular users allowed to sign in to the computer at the actual console, but does not affect who can access the computer system over the network, right? So you've got administrators, backup operators, guests, and users are literally assigned this particular right by default. And I think we've looked at those particular accounts in our previous session in terms of what they provide for as far as usage of your particular machine there is concerned. Obviously, with your backup files and directories, again, allows which, or more or less controls which particular users that are distinctively allowed to back up files, regardless of whether they have the actual necessary file permissions to read those distinctive files. Remember, when you look at the file systems that we've discussed prior, you've got your FAT, NTFS, and one of the functions or features associated with NTFS is file and folder security, which also looks at the whole concept of your access control lists, determining what a specific user can do when it comes to specific files and folders. So you've got your read, your write, read and execute, modify, if it's a folder, list folder contents as typical examples of some of the specific permissions associated with that environment. Then obviously change system time, I think that is self-explanatory. Same difference would go with the whole concept of installation and uninstallation of your distinctive drivers as far as your particular setup there is concerned. So ultimately, if you were to check the actual settings or properties associated with those particular options we're discussing currently, you can look at adding specific groups or removing specific groups as far as your configuration there is concerned. And ultimately, if you look at, again, explanation, you've got determines which users can obviously log on to the actual machine itself as far as basic configurations there is concerned. Same difference if you were to go and select your backup files and directories, the same difference would apply. In that particular instance, you can actually add or remove any particular users or groups dependent on the particular setup that you're looking for. Again, same difference would apply when you're obviously looking at changing your system time as far as your specific setup there is concerned. So ultimately, again, when it comes to this particular environment, like I was saying earlier on, enhances security at large, but ultimately, you obviously need to be clued in terms of what you're actually doing in this particular environment, because you can cause a bit of a detriment when it comes to certain users or accounts accessing and working with the system. So only when you've literally taken the time to digest what it actually means and why it's necessary, should you then be able to appropriately incorporate some of these settings without distinctive issues as far as your particular setup there is concerned. And obviously, when you look at the security options, I think some of the options there that you might want to familiarize yourself with, obviously, within your devices, literally preventing users from installing print drivers. So it's, from a security point of view, you want to literally avoid anything that looks at changing how the system functions at large as far as basic configurations there is concerned. So ultimately, you want to distinctively look at limiting access in that regard. Interactive logon, which obviously is looking at not displaying the last username that was there as far as your particular machine there is concerned. So there you've got your interactive logon not displaying the last username in that particular instance. You currently set to disabled, but obviously you can enable that accordingly. But obviously, this literally makes sign-in more secure by not giving away usernames, obviously to potential hackers, right? As far as your particular setup is concerned. So by default, that is set to disabled. And then if you look at another interactive logon, which would literally be a message attempting to log on as far as your particular. So obviously, what this particular setting allows for, it allows you to display a message to for users before they actually sign in. The message can be instructions about how to sign in, or a warning against unauthorized use. So it all depends. Default is there's no message incorporated there, but ultimately, if you look at when we're looking at user management, right? We mentioned that whole concept of your secure sign-in, where you literally, for lack of a better expression, force users to hit the Control, Alt, and Delete keys on the keyboard as they log in to try and avoid, obviously, malicious code that could mimic basic sign-in options. Because normally some of these particular code configurations might not be able to mimic the actual pressing of keys as far as your particular logins they are concerned. So your secure sign-in platforms just make it a lot more difficult for any malicious code that could try and mimic basic login configurations or actions as far as your particular system there is concerned. So again, you've got you can actually incorporate a message there and apply. And description there, this particular setting just specifies a text message that is displayed to the user when they log on as far as configurations is concerned. So obviously it could be used for legal reasons, for example, to warn users about the ramifications of misusing information and so on. I think you might even found some of these particular type of messages if you've used a public internet cafe, for instance. It's exactly the same concept where they'll give you just a rundown, I think, from a legal point of view, that you're supposed to be accessing the right content, using the machines appropriately and legally as far as configurations there are concerned. So the other one, programs are allowed or disallowed as far as the actual system is concerned, right? So the most common use of this particular app locker is literally malware prevention, right? More often than not, yes, regardless of unauthorized access, as far as human intervention there is concerned, more of these particular settings are literally put in place, obviously, to try and safeguard against your malicious software or your malicious code. And literally, you find that much malware would end up literally installing itself by running from within the actual user's profile. So you obviously can use App Locker to restrict the locations that executables can run from, and obviously potentially avoid that distinctive problem in that regard. So you'll discover that a particularly nasty type of malware Obviously, I think most of you are familiar with it, known as ransomware. This ransomware encrypts files and obviously requires payment for a key to decrypt those particular files. So remember, encryption, scrambling, decryption, descrambling of files or data. And obviously, AppLocker is literally an effective tool to prevent that particular type of malware as far as your particular environments would go. So obviously, you can use you can audit or enforce application rules or app locker rules as far as your particular setup there is concerned, as far as a configuration would go. So if you look at application control, these are your application control policies. So in this particular environment, that's where obviously you'll find enforcement of your distinctive rules as far as configuration there is concerned. So just an add-in of your a snap in there as far as the app locker configuration there is concerned. And obviously, if you expand that app locker, you've got the executable rules, your Windows installer rules, script rules, and obviously packaged app rules as far as your basic configuration there is concerned. So ultimately, as far as configuration there is concerned, you can look at basic enforcement of executable as far as particular setups is concerned. So if you right click on that, we can literally create a new rule that will look at basic enforcement and configuration as far as your particular setup there is concerned. So obviously, you're looking at basic permissions. If we next that, you obviously can look at allow or deny specific users or groups within your specific environment as far as configurations would go. If you're looking at nexting that, publisher, path, file hash. So again, you've got descriptions in terms of what each one of these particular options are all about. For instance, if you look at your file hash, you're selecting that specific option only if you want to create a rule for an application that is not signed. So remember, a typical example of these would be, for instance, if you look at the whole issue of the drivers. Remember, you've got signed and unsigned drivers. I think you've talked about this before in computer architecture, where your unsigned drivers are drivers that have not been tested, right? Which means that there's no guarantee that when you install it within a specific operating system, your Windows, your Linux, and so on, would it run without issues, or is it going to function without any particular problems? So it doesn't necessarily mean that an unsigned driver does not function. The only discrepancy that is there is that obviously you're not guaranteed or literally you're not, there's no particular protection from possible system instability that might occur after that particular driver has been installed. But obviously, when you look at signed drivers, these particular drivers have been distinctively tested. Normally, initially, the specific platform that was responsible for that was your Windows Hardware Quality Lab, or your WHQL, which was responsible for obviously verifying these particular drivers, and then obviously giving them a go-ahead to say, okay, look, this particular driver has been distinctively tested accordingly and should function without any distinctive issues as far as your particular setups there are concerned. So if we leave it as default on the publisher section there, just for argument's sake, you next that, and then ultimately you'll now need to literally incorporate an actual reference as far as your configurations there are concerned. So this is part and parcel of the whole creation of your specific rule as far as consideration there is concerned. So if you were to go back to the whole concept of let me just cancel this quickly. If you go back to the executables, the Windows installer, and the script and whatnot, that would literally indicate the type of file extension. So obviously executables is your .exe and your .com files. If the installers, .msi, .msp files. If they're publisher, if they're script files rather, you're then looking at ps1, .bat, .cmd, .vbs as typical examples of script files that are incorporated as far as your configuration there is concerned. And then obviously your packaged app, these rules apply to .appx files, all right, as far as your particular setup is concerned. And these particular rules are used to control which users can obviously run Windows store apps as far as your configurations would go. So that's a typical setup associated with the whole concept of configuration there. And again, like we mentioned before, you can create new rules. You can look at automatically generated rules, and then also look at create default rules as far as your particular environment or setup there is concerned from a particular point of view, as far as consideration or configurations there are concerned. So ultimately, it's all about just understanding specifically what's happening in this particular instance as far as basic configurations in that regard they are concerned. And again, like we mentioned before, you can have rule exceptions, which literally define software that the rule does literally not apply to as far as your specific environments there are concerned. So that's just the generics as far as your particular app locker setup there is concerned. And remember, you can choose to import a policy, export one, or clear current policies that you've got incorporated. And then you always can check the actual properties that you've got as far as your particular app locker environment there is concerned. So you've got the enforcement, and then you also have configurations on the advanced tab that you can also work with in this particular instance. So how to access that, just right click on your app locker icon there, and then obviously from the options menu that appears, you select properties in that particular aspect. So that's another a way of looking at appropriate security as far as your configurations there would go. You can also discuss the whole concept of security templates within your environments, which obviously are .inf files that contain settings that literally correspond with account policies and local policies within the actual local security policy configuration that you've got as far as setups there would go. So naturally, in addition, security templates can distinctively contain settings for an event log, restricted groups, service configuration, registry security, and obviously file system security at large as far as your setup is concerned. And obviously, you can use these particular templates to apply security settings or compare existing security settings against obviously a basic corporate standard as far as your configurations there is concerned. So that's pretty much that in terms of your configuration when it comes to your particular policies at large. You can also even discuss the auditing part. Remember, when you look at security generically, you've got the AAA, right, which is accounting, sorry, your authentication, authorization, and accounting or auditing, which is just a means of making your environments more secure. Remember, your authentication looks at usernames and passwords or electronic credentials that obviously enable access to a system. And then literally you can also discuss authorization, which looks at the permissions and rights associated with a specific account. And then obviously the accounting and auditing process is just a means of checking what that specific account or profile has done on the system or on the network, whichever way you want to look at it. So literally auditing is the security process that records literally the occurrence of any specific operating system event and obviously incorporates that in a distinctive security log as far as your setups would go. So if you look at the advanced, so we can go back here, the advanced audit policy configuration, and if you were to expand the system audit policies, as far as your local group configuration there is concerned, you've got a whole a list of sections that are there as far as your particular setup would go. And naturally, you've got descriptions always as far as these particular setups there is concerned. So obviously, with your account log on, this is just tracking when users are authenticated by the actual computer. Account management is looking at tracking when users and groups are created. There's detailed tracking in that particular instance, which obviously tracks how a computer system is used by tracking applications, activities, and then all the way down to your global object access auditing, which obviously provides an easy way to specify that all access to files and registry keys, for instance, should be distinctively audited. So this is just checking, again, what a specific individual or account has done as far as your particular environments they are concerned. So ultimately, pretty straightforward content if you want to look at it from a different point of view as far as basic configurations in that regard there would go. So obviously, the other thing that you also might want to discuss in this regard is looking at malware protection naturally. And obviously, your Windows would literally ship with your inbuilt anti-malware package, which is known as your Windows Defender. And ultimately, what that does for you is try to protect against your generic spyware and viruses as far as your particular system they are concerned, and it's activated by default as far as your basic configurations they are concerned, as far as your setup would go. But ultimately, if you want to access it, normally you find that within your task bar and or notification area as far as your particular setups they are concerned. But ultimately, you can access that through your command, your control panel, or ultimately search for it as far as your search bar there is concerned. So we can go directly to our control panel there, and obviously within that environment, we should be able to find and access your Windows. Let's see. Let's expand that a bit. You should be able to find your the Windows Defender. So you've got the anti-malware package, and you also have your Windows Firewall. So remember, Firewall's main purpose is just to look at restricting access from within and from without your network. So connectivity to the external network is literally verified by your firewall. Connectivity from the external to your internal network is obviously also verified by that particular firewall. So it's also another security feature that is put in place to try and avoid unauthorized access to your distinctive systems at large. So if you were to look at the whole concept of your excuse me, Windows Defender configuration there, you've got by default, currently it shows that this particular Defender is on, and you've got your real-time protection, you've got your virus and spyware definitions, which is literally up to date. And obviously, as far as your scanning options are concerned, you've got quick, full, and custom as far as configurations there is concerned. And naturally, you might find that ultimately, when it comes to possibly certain malware that might be identified by the system, some can distinctively not be removed or for lack of a better expression, destroyed by the anti-malware package or by the Windows Defender. So you've got some of them obviously getting quarantined or literally incorporated into a separate section as far as your particular setup there is concerned. So normally you find that when the Defender literally detects potential malware that is obviously of low risk, then the item is distinctively placed in quarantine. Obviously, this prevents the item from running on your computer system and gives you the option to release from quarantine if it is an actual false positive as far as configurations there would go in that regard. So when it comes to another way of protecting your data, naturally, you can discuss the whole concept of encryption, right? So I think when we were discussing user management and so on, we might have thrown in the whole concept of obviously the reason why passwords are essential in terms of accessing a specific machine, but ultimately it's also important for you to encrypt data, which is scrambling data into a non-readable format. And obviously, in order for you to descramble that data, you need to have the appropriate key incorporated in that regard. So this encryption is obviously also incorporated by default when it comes to your Windows 10 Pro and enterprise editions as far as configurations would go. And ultimately, there are two types of encryption platforms that are there, right? You've got what they call symmetric encryption and asymmetric encryption. So with symmetric encryption, normally the algorithm would distinctively use similar keys. So remember, when you want to descramble the data, you'll obviously need to have a key to do that, right? So with symmetric encryption, you've got similar keys for the encryption process as well as the decryption process, right? As far as configuration there is concerned. So ultimately, symmetric encryption uses the same key to encrypt the data and the same key to literally decrypt the data. But obviously, on the other hand, you've got asymmetric encryption, right? Which now literally uses two keys to encrypt the data as well as decrypt it. So you've got one generic public key that is used to encrypt the data, and then you've got a private key that is normally sent to the receiver of whichever data is being sent for them to ultimately be able to descramble the data accordingly as far as configurations there are concerned. So you obviously can also even discuss the whole concept of the encryption or encrypting file system as far as your particular environments there would go. This is obviously part and parcel of the advantages that NTFS has distinctively over FAT as far as basic file systems are concerned. And when you look at the Windows 10 Pro install, you've got your BitLocker drive encryption, all right, which is that particular platform now that is responsible for that particular purpose. And as you can see, protects your PC, obviously using your encryption mechanisms there. So its main purpose, as far as configurations would go, is that it's all about data encryption, all right? So it's a data encryption feature included within this particular Windows 10 install that obviously addresses some of the shortcomings of your EFS, which is your encrypting file system, which was literally designed to encrypt only specific files. Right? So obviously there's a drawback in that regard. So if it's the EFS was designed just to encrypt specific files, obviously that creates a bit of a drawback. And then obviously there are some files such as the operating system files that cannot be encrypted, obviously using that EFS. And in addition, in some cases, it might actually be possible to introduce low-level software that is able to steal EFS encryption certificates in that regard. So obviously, the alternative to that would be your BitLocker drive encryption, and you've got for the in-house hard drive, right, or for your internal hard drive, and you also have BitLocker To Go, which is there for your removable drives, as far as your particular configuration there is concerned. So ultimately, you can look at turning currently set to off there as far as this particular machine there is concerned, but ultimately you can turn it on accordingly. And then, as you can see, you also have your BitLocker To Go, like we were mentioning a couple of seconds ago, which is distinctively responsible for encryption when it comes to the whole concept of your removable flash drives, as well as your removable hard drives as far as configurations they are concerned. But remember, when it comes to the keys there, you obviously need to keep them in a safe space, because you get a lot of individuals who end up losing these particular encryption keys and having to then technically format your drive, because you can't literally then access content that is distinctly stored in that specific setup as far as your configurations would go. So that's pretty much that, literally, when it comes to your security features. I think as far as research is concerned, literally, you can also look at the review questions as far as your particular chapter environment concerned. Review questions will be from page 247 as far as your prescribed textbook is concerned, all the way to 250. There are some review questions that are there, and obviously a couple of exercises, obviously, or activities within the actual chapter itself that will assist in terms of you understanding exactly what is happening as far as configurations and in that particular aspect is concerned. So that's pretty much that. I think We had a couple of technical difficulties in our previous session there, so obviously I had to record this separately as far as configurations would go, but I'm sure you should be good in that regard. Please look through this again. Should you have any distinctive issues, please pop me a mail, and then we can always engage ourselves accordingly as far as that particular platform is concerned. But otherwise, I think that should do that for us as far as content would go. And like I mentioned before, just look through 247 to 250 as far as chapter number 6 of your prescribed textbook there is concerned. And ultimately, again, like I mentioned before, should you literally need any assistance or literally any a revisit of that particular content in terms of enhancing your understanding, like I mentioned a couple of seconds ago, just pop me a mail and then we should be good to go. But otherwise, I think that concludes this one. We'll see you in the next session. Cheers.